The second presentation will be that by Mrs. Anne Fily, who is in charge of the Economic and Legal Department of the European Consumer Association, BUC. We see that there are various ways of providing for financial inclusion and offering basic banking services. Unfortunately, these methods are usually rather formal and not always implemented. Perhaps before you start, could I ask you whether the collective action measures, can they, with others, serve as a means to make these rights truly effective so that those who need them should be able to enjoy these rights? Thank you, Georges. Well, let me start right away with the more repressive side of things in the case of non-application of the rules. Later on, I'll go back to what we understand as the basic bank account and the fact that we place this in the area of essential services that should be accessible to everybody. We're also in favor of legislation which would make it possible for me to pick up your point about non-respect of legislation, as a result of which we could find legal means to act. Collective action in the form of damages or reparation is not necessarily the easiest method to act against non-implementation of banking rights, because this kind of action seeks to repair damage which has been suffered. So for each consumer, one would have to identify the way in which a refusal of opening an account has caused this person damage. So collective action is a bit difficult unless you manage to identify a category of consumers who might have been excluded from access to bank accounts. But there are other means, injunction actions, on the basis of which, if a number of rules have not been respected, imagine, say, a bank that systematically refuses to open a bank account to a particular category of consumers, then consumer associations, in particular those that are authorized to undertake this kind of action, could approach a judge and get the judge to enjoin the bank to accept such consumers in the future, whereby thus a kind of order would be given to the bank that had not respected legislation. And there is, we hope, going to be draft EU legislation on access to basic bank accounts, and we hope to extend the directive on injunctions to cover this kind of action. But let me come back to what we consider to be a basic right, that is the bank account. We consider this to be an essential service, and it shouldn't be targeted to a particular category of the population. The whole adult population should be able to open a bank account. I won't go back over the difficulties that persons who do not have bank accounts have to face. This is what, for us, justifies the fact that this is just as important in modern society as access to energy, for example. Now, this kind of basic bank account, as you have indicated, make it possible for a consumer to place funds, transfer funds, or withdraw funds, both physically and electronically. Such an account, we feel, should include a debit account, not just a card with an amount on it, but also a card making it possible to withdraw funds at any cash dispenser, and also electronic payments, both face-to-face and remotely. Another point you mentioned is this. We too are in favor of an overdraft facility being offered, making it possible to cover buffer periods, because debit and credit operations, the times at which they are conducted, are not under the control of the consumer. And we feel that this buffer period should not involve charges for the consumer. I'm not speaking about a real overdraft authorization, but a buffer system. A basic account shouldn't be subject either to the need to signing up to other compulsory services or products that the consumer doesn't need. And the consumer should also have access to a monthly bank statement, as for any other bank account. And also this kind of bank should be, or bank account should be offered online. Why not? Because the youngest adults, even if they're not excluded, are very open to this kind of online account. Now, what conditions should be fulfilled so as to be able to have this kind of account? Any adult over the age of 18 of whatever nationality residing anywhere in the EU should have access to this kind of bank account. All retail banks should offer this. There's no reason for discrimination, nor is there any reason to stigmatize people. I recognize you through the bank that you account, which means that you have a poor person's account, as it were, and criteria such as the level of income, regularity of income, having a job or not, having a credit history in the country which is either positive or negative, and proof of permanent residence. None of these should be criteria taken into account when it comes to allowing a person to open a basic bank account. There's also a point of interpretation of the legislation on money laundering, because we note that this legislation is often used to refuse the opening of a bank account. So there are problems of interpretation of this kind of legislation. If banks consider that there are legitimate grounds to refuse the opening of an account, this should not be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. There should be a limiting and precise list of criteria at the and this should be done through legislation. Then there's another point on which not everyone agrees. For us, a basic bank account should not just meet the needs of people who don't have bank accounts today. It should also meet the needs of people who today do have a bank account, but bank accounts which are expensive because their means are limited, and because there is no basic bank account, they have no other option than to open an expensive bank account. So we don't see why one day a basic bank account shouldn't be available everywhere. Consumers today who have very expensive bank accounts, which are expensive because they involve services they don't need, should be able to have access to a basic bank account. And restricting such bank accounts to certain types of consumer could create discrimination among them according to the date at which they open this bank account, which is why we feel that any consumer should be able to have access to a basic bank account. This obviously has an impact on bank fees or charges. For us, the price of a bank account should be reasonable. This is obviously a vague concept that needs to be made more precise, and we could use a number of reference indices which would be undisputable, and for particularly less favored people, we could consider such an account being free of charge. Of course, there would have to be a financing mechanism that would have to be devised for this. We're in favor, for all of this, of legislative initiatives being taken. We have mentioned that very often voluntary systems are not satisfactory, but sometimes even when there is legislation, the system that emerges is not entirely operational. I have in mind, in particular, the French example, which has been described. So we're in favor of European legislation that could be based on a minimum harmonization approach, so as to allow member states that need to complete these requirements in terms of the national situation to add further conditions. And an important point, there's no point having a good system if in the end it's not known to those who need it most. So it's also important that the existence of this kind of basic bank account should be made known. This is obviously the role of banks when they receive their customers and when they supply documents. It's also the role of the public authorities and naturally the role of civil society, including consumer associations in their relations with their members and the people they're in contact with. Thank you.